I woke up to the deafening sound of sirens echoing through the paper-thin walls of my new reality, a cramped studio apartment in Oakland that cost $4,200 per month, more than most Americans earn in 2 months, yet felt like a concrete prison cell compared to the sprawling Blackwood mansion I'd called home for 28 privileged years. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me as I stared at the water stains on the ceiling. 24 hours ago, I was Tyler Blackwood, heir apparent to a $2.8 billion technology empire. Now, I was just another broke millennial struggling to survive California's insane cost of living. The catastrophic events of that dinner party replayed in my mind like a nightmarish broken record, each detail more painful than the last. Dad's 65th birthday celebration at our magnificent Palo Alto estate, with Silicon Valley's most powerful investors and venture capitalists gathered around our imported Italian mahogany dining table, worth more than most people's houses. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light over faces worth billions collectively, and the conversation had naturally turned to the future of technology and generational wisdom in leadership. That's when I made the most expensive mistake of my entire existence. Dad, with all due respect, your approach to AI integration is completely outdated and frankly embarrassing, I had declared, my voice carrying confidence across the suddenly silent room. You're thinking like an old man who's terrified of technological change. Sometimes I genuinely wonder if you're just too much of an old-school traditionalist to understand where the industry is actually heading in 2025. The words old-school traditionalist hung in the air like toxic gas. I watched the color drain from every face around that table. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their $10,000 chairs, their spouses exchanging horrified glances. Mom's hand flew to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. But Dad? Richard Blackwood just smiled, that bone-chilling, calculating smile I'd witnessed him use on competitors moments before, systematically destroying their companies and dreams. Fascinating perspective. Tyler, he had replied in a voice so quiet it was terrifying. We'll absolutely discuss this privately very soon. That private discussion materialized at exactly 9:47 a.m., the following morning when every single one of my credit cards was brutally declined at the Starbucks on University Avenue. The young barista's mortified expression as she handed back my black American Express Centurion card, the one with no preset spending limit, will haunt my dreams forever. By noon, my electronic access to the family's $15 million Manhattan penthouse had been permanently revoked. By 6 p.m., I was desperately signing a lease on this suffocating Oakland apartment with the pathetic $3,000 remaining in my personal checking account. I grabbed my iPhone with trembling hands, desperately hoping to find supportive messages from the so-called friends who'd witnessed my public destruction. Instead, I discovered a digital graveyard of read receipts and deliberately ignored calls. The news of my complete financial excommunication had apparently spread through Silicon Valley's elite social circles faster than wildfire through drought-stricken California hills. These people who had enthusiastically laughed at my jokes and celebrated my achievements just days before had vanished like morning fog over San Francisco Bay, but the most soul-crushing blow arrived in the form of a single, ice-cold text message from my father delivered at exactly 11:59 p.m. You have 30 days to prove you understand what real value means in this world. Use them wisely, son. RB 30 days. The number felt simultaneously impossibly short and eternally long, like a death sentence with a timer attached. If you've ever experienced that devastating moment when poor judgment completely shattered everything you thought you knew about your life, you understand the crushing weight that settled on my chest as I stared at those words glowing on my screen. As I sat on the edge of my narrow bed that night, watching Oakland's endless traffic crawl past my grimy window, something disturbing nagged at the deepest corners of my mind. Dad's reaction had been far too calm, too measured and controlled for someone who'd just been publicly humiliated by his own flesh and blood. Richard Blackwood didn't simply cut people off from his fortune, he systematically destroyed them piece by piece, reputation by reputation. But this felt fundamentally different. Almost meticulously planned. What I couldn't have known then was that my father had already been secretly tracking some very suspicious phone calls coming from inside our own family, and my arrogant outburst had just handed him the perfect cover for what he was really planning to execute. The full magnitude of what I'd lost didn't truly hit me until I tried to return to Blackwood Technologies headquarters 3 days after my financial execution. Walking through those familiar glass doors of our 30-story building in downtown San Jose felt like visiting my own grave. The security guard who'd greeted me with enthusiasm for years suddenly couldn't make eye contact. Blackwood Technologies wasn't just a company. It was a Silicon Valley legend worth $2.8 billion built from Dad's garage startup in 1987 when I was barely a dream. The empire sprawled across 3 California campuses, employed over 12,000 people, and held patents that shaped how the world interacted with artificial intelligence. Our quarterly earnings reports moved stock markets. Tech journalists hung on Dad's every word, and I was supposed to inherit all of it. My former life of luxury now felt like someone else's fever dream. The red Ferrari 488 GTB that I'd driven to Stanford parties was gone, repossessed while I slept in my Oakland apartment. My platinum card, that once had no spending limit, couldn't buy me a cup of coffee. The Manhattan penthouse where I'd hosted industry leaders was sealed off like a crime scene. My trust fund, which had generated $50,000 monthly since my 21st birthday, had vanished into legal paperwork faster than I could comprehend. But the most devastating blow came from the people I'd considered friends. My phone, once buzzing constantly with party invitations and business opportunities, had become a monument to digital silence. Marcus Chen, my Stanford roommate who'd borrowed $30,000 from me just last month, suddenly couldn't remember my number. Jessica Walsh, the venture capitalist I'd been dating, left me a voicemail that was professionally brutal. "Tyler, I think we should take some time apart while you figure things out." Even my personal trainer at the exclusive Palo Alto Athletic Club informed me my membership had been indefinitely suspended. What disturbed me most was how quickly Silicon Valley's elite had erased me from their exclusive world. These people operated like a hive mind, and apparently my father had sent a very clear message. Tyler Blackwood no longer exists. On my 4th day of exile, I mustered the courage to visit Blackwood Technologies one more time. I needed to retrieve some personal items from my corner office on the 23rd floor, the office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the South Bay, where I'd once felt invincible. But when I approached the reception desk, something chilling happened. Sarah Martinez, the receptionist who'd worked there for 6 years and always chatted about her daughter's soccer games, completely avoided eye contact. She fumbled with papers, answered phantom phone calls, and generally acted like I was invisible. When I finally managed to get her attention, she mumbled something about needing authorization from Mr. Blackwood Sr. and practically fled to the bathroom. That's when the first real warning bell started ringing in my head. Sarah's behavior wasn't just awkward, it was terrified. Like she'd been specifically instructed to avoid me at all costs. As I rode the elevator down in stunned silence, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Day 26 remaining. Time moves faster than you think. Anonymous. Someone was watching. Someone was counting down. I stepped out into the California sunshine, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Dad's punishment felt too precise, too calculated for simple parental discipline. And now, mysterious messages. The paranoid. Part of my brain started wondering if my public humiliation had been just the opening move in a much larger game. What I didn't realize was that while I'd been drowning in self-pity and luxury withdrawal, my father had been methodically gathering evidence of a betrayal so close to home, it would shatter everything I thought I knew about my own family. Litia. Countdown had begun, but I wasn't the only one running out of time. By the end of my first week in exile, the strangest thing happened. My sister Emily reached out, not with mockery or lecture, but with what seemed like genuine concern. For someone who'd spent most of our adult lives treating me like an annoying obligation at family gatherings, her sudden sisterly affection felt completely out of character. "Tyler, I know Dad can be harsh sometimes," she said during our coffee meeting at a neutral cafe in Mountain View, carefully chosen away from our usual Silicon Valley haunts. "Maybe I can help bridge the gap between you two. I've been talking to him, and I think there might be a way to work this out." Emily looked different somehow, more polished, more confident than I remembered. Her designer handbag was new, a $8,000 Hermes that definitely hadn't been in her collection before. For someone working as a marketing consultant with irregular income, she was certainly living well lately. "I appreciate the concern, but I think I need to handle this myself," I replied, studying her face for tells. Something about her eagerness to help felt performative, like she was reading from a script. "Don't be stubborn, Tyler. Pride goes before a fall, and you've already fallen pretty far." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Besides, family should stick together during difficult times. That evening, I decided to drive past the family estate in Palo Alto, partly from masochistic curiosity and partly because I missed the place that had been my anchor for nearly 3 decades. What I discovered made my blood run cold. 3 unfamiliar black sedans sat in our circular driveway. Not the usual collection of Dad's business associates' Mercedes and Teslas, but generic corporate vehicles that screamed, "official meeting." Through the massive windows of Dad's study, I could see silhouettes gathered around his conference table, more people than usual for his typical evening business calls. I parked across the street, hidden behind our neighbor's hedge, and watched for nearly 2 hours. The meeting broke up around 11 p.m., and I managed to photograph the license plates as the mysterious visitors departed. Something told me these weren't routine business discussions. The next morning brought another unsettling discovery. While grabbing lunch from a food truck near my Oakland apartment, I found a crumpled paper in the nearby trash bin that made my heart skip. It was a letterhead from Nexus Dynamics, Blackwood Technology's biggest competitor and the company we'd been battling for market dominance for 3 years. The paper was mostly illegible, damaged by coffee stains and rain, but I could make out fragments: confidential acquisition, proposal, and timeline acceleration. Necessary. Most disturbing was a handwritten note in the margin that looked suspiciously like Emily's distinctive cursive. "Richard's decision pending." My paranoid instincts kicked into overdrive. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way conversations stopped when I walked into restaurants. The fact that 3 different Uber drivers had declined my rides after seeing my pickup location. The mysterious van that seemed to be parked on my street every afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m. But the most unnerving incident happened during my second attempt to visit Blackwood Technologies. This time, I made it past reception, but something felt fundamentally wrong. Employees I'd known for years suddenly found urgent reasons to avoid the hallways when I appeared. Conversations died mid-sentence. It was like I'd become a ghost haunting my own family's company. In the elevator, I overheard 2 senior engineers discussing something that froze my blood. The transition timeline got moved up again. Richard wants everything ready by the end of the month. Transition? What transition? That night I couldn't sleep. The pieces of this puzzle weren't adding up to simple parental punishment anymore. Dad's behavior, Emily's sudden helpfulness, the mysterious meetings, the corporate espionage hints. It all pointed to something much larger and more dangerous than a father. Teaching his arrogant son a lesson, I was starting to realize that my insulting outburst might have been just the excuse someone had been waiting for. But excuse for what? As I lay in my cramped bed, staring at the Oakland streetlights bleeding through my thin curtains, one terrifying thought kept circling through my mind. What if I wasn't the target of this elaborate scheme? What if I was just collateral damage in someone else's plan to destroy everything Dad had built? 22 days remained on my countdown, but I was beginning to suspect that the real deadline had nothing to do with my redemption. The memory hit me like lightning at 3 a.m. on day 9 of my exile, jolting me awake with such clarity that I wondered how I'd forgotten it for so long. I was 16 years old, sitting in detention at Menlo Atherton High School, bored out of my mind and furious at being punished for something I hadn't done. That's when I'd first discovered my gift. While other kids were serving their time in silent misery, I had methodically hacked into the school's entire computer system using nothing but a library terminal and my inherent understanding of security vulnerabilities. Within 2 hours, I'd not only cleared my detention record but also uncovered the real culprit behind the cheating scandal that had landed me there. The rush of digital detective work had been intoxicating. Tyler's got a brilliant analytical mind, my computer science teacher had told Dad during parent conferences. He sees patterns and security flaws that take most professionals years to recognize. With proper channeling, he could revolutionize cybersecurity. But Dad had dismissed it as teenage hacking nonsense and immediately enrolled me in business and leadership courses instead. The company needs a CEO, not a computer technician, he'd declared, effectively burying my passion under layers of corporate expectations and social obligations. Now, sitting in my Oakland apartment with nothing but time and desperation, I realized that my forgotten talent might be the key to understanding what was really happening to my family. I pulled out my laptop, an old MacBook Pro that had survived my financial purge because it was technically worthless compared to my other possessions, and began doing what I should have done weeks ago. If someone was playing games with the Blackwood Empire, they'd left digital footprints. I just needed to know where to look. Starting with basic reconnaissance, I accessed public records about Nexus Dynamics, our primary competitor. What I discovered made my hands shake with excitement and terror. Over the past 8 months, Nexus had been systematically acquiring smaller tech, companies that filled gaps in their portfolio, gaps that perfectly complemented Blackwood Technologies' strengths. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to test my cybersecurity skills against Dad's email system. I knew his passwords better than anyone. He'd been using variations of family birthdays and our old dog's name for decades. Despite my repeated warnings about digital security, breaking into Dad's email felt like violating sacred ground. But desperation had eliminated my moral boundaries. What I found in his deleted items folder nearly gave me a heart attack. Buried among routine business correspondence were email threads that painted a picture so shocking I had to read them 3 times to believe what I was seeing. The threads dated back 6 months, long before my disastrous birthday outburst. "Richard, we've detected unusual activity in your server logs. Someone with internal access has been systematically downloading client data and strategic planning documents. The timestamps suggest after-hours access, potentially using administrator privileges." The email was from Marcus Webb, our head of IT security, and it was marked confidential, board level only. Dad's response was even more chilling. "Continue monitoring. Do not alert anyone else to this investigation. I need to identify the source before taking action. Prepare complete access logs for the past year." My heart pounded as I scrolled through months of covert correspondence between Dad and our security team. They'd been tracking a corporate spy for half a year. Someone with high-level access had been feeding our most sensitive information to external parties, and Dad had been building a case in absolute secrecy. The final email in the thread, sent just 2 days before my birthday disaster, contained a partial list of suspicious access times. As I scanned the timestamps, one pattern made my blood run cold. Most of the unauthorized access occurred during weekday afternoons and weekend evenings, exactly when Emily typically visited the office to help with marketing projects. Suddenly, Emily's new Hermes bag, her mysterious confidence, her sudden interest in helping me reconcile with Dad, it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. My sister wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to control the situation because she was the traitor Dad had been hunting. But that realization led to an even more terrifying question. If Dad knew Emily was stealing company secrets, why hadn't he confronted her? Why had he used my public insult as an excuse to cut me off instead of dealing with the real threat to his empire? Unless my outburst had actually been the perfect cover for something much more elaborate. A way to shake up the entire family dynamic and force the real traitor to reveal themselves completely. As dawn broke over Oakland, I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face for weeks. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't being tested. I was being used as bait. The revelation that I was bait should have been the biggest shock of my investigation, but what I discovered next made everything else pale in comparison. Hidden in a password-protected folder labeled Insurance Policy on Dad's email server was an audio file that would change everything. I thought I knew about that. Disastrous birthday dinner. The file name was chillingly specific. Tyler birthday dinner. Full recording March 15, 2025. Wave. My hands trembled as I downloaded the 47-minute audio file. Dad had recorded the entire evening. Not just my outburst, but every conversation before and after. The sound quality was crystal clear, suggesting professional recording equipment hidden throughout the dining room. He had planned this documentation with military precision. I put on my headphones and pressed play, bracing myself for the humiliation of hearing my own arrogant words again. But what I heard in the first few minutes made my blood freeze. "Emily, are you absolutely certain about the timeline?" Dad's voice was barely audible, clearly captured during cocktails before dinner when guests were mingling. "The Nexus acquisition offer expires in 6 weeks, and I need to know if you can deliver what you've promised them." Emily's response was equally quiet but devastating. "Dad, I've been feeding them our AI development roadmap for 8 months. They're confident they can integrate our technology with their existing platform. The $4.2 billion offer is contingent on them getting our complete source code library, which I can access through Tyler's administrator privileges." My stomach dropped into an abyss of betrayal and confusion. Not only was Emily selling company secrets, but she was planning to use my access credentials to complete the theft. And Dad was talking to her like they were co-conspirators. I fast-forwarded through casual dinner conversation until I reached my infamous outburst. Hearing myself call Dad an old-school traditionalist was painful enough, but Dad's response sounded completely different knowing what I now knew. His calm, measured reaction wasn't the response of a humiliated father. It was the performance of a man executing a carefully orchestrated plan. But the most shocking revelation came in the audio's final 10 minutes, recorded after most guests had left. Only 3 voices remained: Dad, Emily, and someone I couldn't immediately identify. "Richard, your son's public display was perfect," the unknown voice said with a slight accent that sounded vaguely European. "Our board is convinced that Tyler is a liability to Blackwood Technology's future. This gives us the justification we need to move forward with the acquisition without him as a complicating factor." "Excellent," Dad replied. "Emily, you've played your part beautifully. Tyler's exile gives you unrestricted access to finalize the data transfer. Make sure everything is downloaded by the end of this month." "What about Tyler?" Emily asked, and for the first time I heard genuine concern in her voice. "He's not actually going to be permanently cut off, is he? This is just temporary, right?" The long pause that followed was more terrifying than any words could have been. "That depends entirely on how much he discovers during his 30-day countdown," Dad said finally. "If Tyler proves he's developed the intelligence and resourcefulness I always hoped he possessed, then we'll welcome him into the real family business. If not..." The recording ended abruptly. I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd just learned. My father hadn't been tracking Emily as a corporate spy. He'd been working with her to orchestrate the sale of Blackwood Technologies to Nexus Dynamics. But the sale wasn't just about money. It was some kind of test, and I was the unwitting subject. The 30-day countdown wasn't about redemption or proving my worth as a son. It was about proving my worth as a potential partner in whatever larger scheme Dad was really running. Emily's betrayal was scripted. My exile was manufactured drama designed to see if I had the intelligence and determination to uncover the truth. But that realization led to an even more disturbing question. What happened to people who failed Dad's tests? I thought about all the competitors who had mysteriously collapsed after challenging Blackwood Technologies. The rival startups whose funding had dried up overnight. The executives who had suddenly found themselves unemployable after crossing my father. Richard Blackwood didn't just defeat his enemies, he erased them from existence. As I stared at the audio file glowing on my screen, one terrifying truth became crystal clear. I wasn't just being tested for inclusion in Dad's inner circle. I was being tested for survival. The countdown continued, but now I understood what would happen when it reached 0. If I hadn't proven my worth by then, I wouldn't just lose my inheritance, I would lose everything. 21 days remained, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that my father might be far more dangerous than any enemy I'd ever imagined. Armed with the knowledge that Emily and Dad were co-conspirators rather than victim and traitor, I dove deeper into the digital evidence with newfound urgency. If their conversation about Nexus dynamics was real, there would be financial trails, communication records, and documentation that even they couldn't completely hide. What I discovered over the next 18 hours of non-stop investigation shattered every assumption I'd held about my family. Emily hadn't just been stealing company secrets, she'd been systematically embezzling funds through a complex network of shell corporations. Using forensic accounting techniques I'd learned during my brief stint at Stanford Business School, I traced a pattern of financial manipulation that spanned nearly 2 years. The numbers were staggering. Through fake consulting contracts, inflated marketing expenses, and phantom vendor payments, Emily had siphoned $2.3 million from Blackwood Technologies. But the money hadn't gone into personal accounts. Instead, it had been funneled through 3 different offshore companies before landing in investment funds. Controlled by Nexus Dynamics, she wasn't just selling our secrets. She was literally financing our competitors' ability to acquire us. The email evidence painted an even more disturbing picture. Messages between Emily and Nexus executives dating back 18 months revealed a long-term strategy to weaken Blackwood Technologies from within. Emily had been sabotaging client relationships, delaying product launches, and feeding misinformation to our engineering teams to create the appearance that the company was struggling under Dad's leadership. The market needs to see Richard Blackwood as an aging CEO who's lost his edge, one email from Nexus's chief strategy officer read. Your inside intelligence has been invaluable in timing our competitive strikes. The board is prepared to offer $4.2 billion for a distressed acquisition, assuming you can deliver the AI source code and eliminate Tyler as a succession threat. Emily's response was chillingly businesslike. Tyler's public outburst was perfect timing. Richard is using it as cover to cut him out completely. Once Tyler's inheritance rights are legally severed, I'll be the sole heir and can authorize the sale. The source code transfer will happen through Tyler's administrative access, making him the apparent perpetrator if anyone investigates later. But the most devastating revelation came in Emily's private communications with someone identified only as MK, messages that revealed her true motivation wasn't money, but revenge. 28 years of watching Mom and Dad worship their precious son while treating me like an afterthought, she wrote in one particularly bitter message. Tyler got the trust fund, the company mentorship, the Stanford education, even the corner office with the best view. I got marketing consulting work and whatever scraps they threw my way. This acquisition will make me the hero who saved the company after Tyler's spectacular failure. And Richard will finally see who the competent child really is. The timeline of her betrayal corresponded exactly with Tyler's graduation from Stanford and his official appointment as heir apparent to Blackwood Technologies. Emily's descent into corporate espionage hadn't been motivated by greed. It had been fueled by decades of perceived favoritism and sibling rivalry taken to sociopathic extremes, but as I read through months of her correspondence, one detail kept nagging at me. Emily's messages consistently referenced Richard's approval and Dad's knowledge of the timeline. If she was really betraying the family, why did she sound like she was reporting to Dad rather than deceiving him? The answer came in a password-protected file hidden deep in Emily's cloud storage. A file I accessed using social engineering techniques that would have made my high school computer science teacher proud. What I found was a signed contract dated 6 months ago. It was an agreement between Emily Blackwood and Richard Blackwood, outlining Emily's role as corporate intelligence asset in a strategic acquisition facilitation project. The EU contract explicitly authorized her to engage in necessary financial irregularities and information sharing to create market conditions favorable to controlled acquisition. Dad hadn't just known about Emily's betrayal, he had orchestrated it. But the contract's final clause made my hands shake with terror. Upon successful completion of the acquisition project, Emily Blackwood will assume the position of Chief Executive Officer of the merged entity, contingent upon the permanent resolution of all succession complications. Permanent resolution of all succession complications. That phrase could only mean one thing. Tyler Blackwood needed to disappear. As dawn broke over Oakland for the second consecutive day I'd spent sleepless in front of my laptop, the horrifying truth finally crystallized. This wasn't a test of my worthiness to join the family business. This was an elaborate plot to eliminate me while making Emily appear to be the competent successor who had saved the company from both Tyler's incompetence and external threats. The countdown wasn't about redemption. It was about giving them enough time to complete their setup while establishing Tyler's isolation and desperation as motivation for whatever tragic accident or mental breakdown they had planned for day 0. 18 days remained, and I finally understood that I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance or my family relationships. I was fighting for my life. The knowledge that my own family was planning my elimination should have sent me into panic, but instead, it triggered something I'd never felt before: cold, calculating determination. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had clarity about what I was fighting and what I needed to do to survive. I spent the next 48 hours methodically documenting everything I'd discovered, treating the investigation like the most important project of my life. Screenshots of every email, timestamps of every suspicious transaction, audio files backed up to multiple cloud services under fake accounts. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence of what they'd done. But evidence alone wouldn't save me. I needed allies, and in Silicon Valley there was only one person I could trust with information this explosive: Marcus Rivera, Dad's executive assistant for the past 12 years. Marcus had always been more than just an assistant. He was Dad's institutional memory, the keeper of secrets, and the only person who had access to Richard Blackwood's complete schedule and communications. More importantly, Marcus had always treated me with genuine respect, not the performative deference I'd grown accustomed to from people who wanted access to the Blackwood fortune. I arranged to meet Marcus at a small Vietnamese restaurant in San Jose, far from the Silicon Valley power lunch spots where we might be recognized. When I showed him the evidence I'd gathered, his reaction confirmed my worst fears. "Tyler, I've been wondering when you'd figure this out," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "I've been working for your father for 12 years, and I've never seen him plan anything this elaborate. The acquisition isn't just about money, it's about legacy. Your father wants to be remembered as the visionary who built Blackwood Technologies, sold it at its peak value, and transferred power to the most capable successor. But Emily isn't capable," I protested. "She's been sabotaging the company for 2 years. Marcus shook his head grimly. "That's exactly why she's perfect for his plan. Emily will be a puppet CEO for exactly long enough to complete the Nexus merger. Then she'll be quietly replaced by Nexus executives, and your father will retire as the brilliant strategist who engineered the deal. Meanwhile, Tyler Blackwood will be remembered as the entitled heir who self-destructed spectacularly." "What about the permanent resolution clause?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression darkened. "Your father has been researching overseas business opportunities. There's been talk about sending you to manage a special project in Southeast Asia, somewhere remote, where communications are unreliable and accidents happen to young Americans who get in over their heads." The blood drained from my face as the implications hit me. Dad wasn't planning to kill me directly. He was planning to send me somewhere I could disappear conveniently, leaving behind just enough digital evidence of erratic behavior and poor decisions to make my disappearance look like the inevitable conclusion of a spoiled rich kid's downward spiral. "Marcus, I need your help," I said, abandoning any pretense of family loyalty. "I need access to Dad's real schedule, his private communications, and documentation of this Southeast Asia project. Tyler, if your father discovers I'm helping you, I'll be destroyed just as thoroughly as you will be," Marcus replied. But after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "However, I've been documenting everything for my own protection. Your father isn't the only one who believes in insurance policies." Over the next hour, Marcus revealed information that transformed my understanding of the situation entirely. Dad's plan wasn't just about acquiring Blackwood Technologies. It was about eliminating potential witnesses to decades of corporate espionage, insider trading, and strategic elimination of competitors. The Nexus acquisition would bury evidence of practices that could have sent Richard Blackwood to federal prison. Your father has been systematically destroying people who threatened his empire. For 20 years, Marcus explained. The acquisition gives him a clean exit while positioning Emily as the fall guy if any of his historical activities ever come to light. She thinks she's getting revenge on you, but she's actually being set up as the scapegoat for her father's crimes. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something resembling hope. Dad's plan was elaborate, but it was also fragile. Too many moving pieces, too many people who could turn against him if they understood what was really happening. I need to flip Emily, I realized aloud. If she understands that Dad is planning to destroy her too, maybe we can work together to expose him. Marcus looked skeptical. "Emily has been planning your elimination for months. Why would she believe you now?" "Because I have something she doesn't," I replied, feeling my old confidence returning for the first time in weeks. "I have proof of Dad's real plan. And I have 14 days to convince her that we're both victims of the same sociopath." As I walked back to my Oakland apartment that evening, I felt the weight of destiny settling on my shoulders. I wasn't just fighting for my inheritance anymore. I was fighting to expose one of the most elaborate corporate conspiracies in Silicon Valley history. The countdown continued, but now I had a plan. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed I might actually win. The quarterly investor meeting was scheduled for day 12 of my countdown, exactly 2 weeks before my supposed permanent resolution. It was perfect timing for what I had planned, the most spectacular corporate revelation in Silicon Valley history, broadcast live to the tech industry's most powerful decision-makers. I spent 3 days preparing my presentation with obsessive precision. Every screenshot documented, every financial transaction verified, every audio clip synchronized with corresponding email timestamps. This wasn't just about exposing Dad and Emily. It was about dismantling 20 years of corporate crime in front of an audience that could ensure justice. Marcus had provided me with crucial intelligence. The investor meeting would include representatives from the SEC, venture capital firms that had invested billions in Blackwood Technologies, and journalists from TechCrunch, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. If I could present my evidence credibly, the fallout would be immediate and devastating. But I needed Emily to be there, and that required the most dangerous gambit of my life. "Emily, I know everything," I said when I called her on day 10. Dad's plan, the Nexus acquisition, the Southeast Asia elimination project. We need to meet immediately. The long silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't surprised by my discovery. She was calculating how to respond. "Tyler, I think you're having some kind of breakdown," she said finally, her voice carefully modulated for someone who might be recording the call. "Maybe you should consider getting professional help." "I have the audio recording from Dad's birthday dinner," I replied calmly. "All 47 minutes of it, including your conversation about the $4.2 billion acquisition and using my administrator credentials. I also have documentation of the $2.3 million you've embezzled through shell corporations, and, most importantly, I have Dad's contract with you outlining your role as corporate intelligence asset." This time the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "What do you want?" she whispered finally. "I want you to understand that Dad isn't making you CEO because you're competent," I said, letting steel enter my voice. "He's setting you up as the scapegoat for decades of corporate crimes. Check the fine print of your contract, Emily. What happens to you after the acquisition completes?" I gave her 24 hours to research what I'd told her, knowing that her own paranoia and intelligence would lead her to the same terrifying conclusions I'd reached. When she called back, she sounded like a completely different person. "Tyler, we need to meet," she said, her voice shaking. I found additional contract provisions I'd never seen before. Termination clauses, liability transfers, criminal indemnification agreements that make me responsible for any pre-acquisition irregularities. We met at the same Vietnamese restaurant where Marcus had revealed Dad's true plans. Emily looked haggard, her designer confidence replaced by genuine fear. "I thought I was getting revenge for 28 years of being the forgotten daughter," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I never imagined Dad was planning to destroy both of us. Emily, I need you to do something that will require more courage than you've ever shown in your life," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "I need you to present evidence of Dad's crimes at tomorrow's investor meeting. In front of the SEC, the press, and everyone who matters in Silicon Valley." "Tyler, he'll destroy me," she whispered. "He's already planning to destroy you," I replied. "This is your only chance to control the narrative instead of being buried by it." The next morning, I arrived at Blackwood Technologies for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. Security tried to stop me, but I had something they didn't expect. Emily walking beside me, vouching for my presence as a family representative with important information for the board. The investor meeting was held in our largest conference room, with 37 of Silicon Valley's most influential people gathered around the mahogany table where this nightmare had begun. Dad sat at the head of the table, projecting the calm authority that had built his empire. When he saw Emily and me enter together, I watched something flicker across his face, the first crack in his perfect composure I'd seen in my entire life. "Richard," said Catherine Walsh, our lead investor and Jessica's mother, "I believe your children have requested time to address the board. Given the unusual circumstances surrounding recent family developments, we've agreed to hear them out." I plugged my laptop into the presentation system and looked directly at my father. "Dad, 3 weeks ago you told me I had 30 days to prove I understood real value. Today, I'm going to show everyone in this room what you really value." The first slide was the audio waveform from his secret recording of the birthday dinner. The second was a financial flowchart showing Emily's embezzlement trail. The third was his contract authorizing her corporate espionage. But the fourth slide was the one that made several investors gasp audibly. A comprehensive timeline showing 20 years of strategic competitor elimination, insider trading, and systematic corporate espionage that had built Blackwood Technologies into a $2.8 billion empire through criminal means. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying across the stunned silence, "you're not investing in a legitimate technology company. You're funding the most sophisticated corporate crime syndicate in Silicon Valley history." The presentation took 47 minutes, exactly the length of Dad's secret recording. When I finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system humming. Dad stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Tyler, you have just destroyed everything our family has built." "No, Dad," Emily said, standing beside me with documents in her shaking hands. "We're exposing what you built on the graves of everyone you eliminated. And we're making sure you can't eliminate us, too." The SEC representative was already reaching for his phone. The journalists were frantically typing notes. The investors were calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from Blackwood Technologies. Richard Blackwood's empire was crumbling in real time, and for the first time in my life I felt like I truly understood what real value meant. The aftermath of our presentation unfolded like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Within 6 hours, the SEC had frozen all Blackwood Technologies assets pending a federal investigation. By evening, the FBI had raided our Palo Alto mansion, our corporate headquarters, and Emily's apartment, seizing computers, documents, and evidence that would fuel prosecutions for years to come. Dad was arrested at 7:23 p.m. in his own driveway, led away in handcuffs while news crews captured every humiliating moment for the tech world to witness. The man who had spent decades destroying his competitors with calculated precision was himself destroyed by the children he had underestimated and betrayed. Emily's fate was more complex. Her cooperation with federal investigators and her role in exposing Dad's broader criminal enterprise earned her immunity from prosecution, but the court of public opinion was less forgiving. Silicon Valley's elite social circles closed ranks against her just as they had against me. But this time the exile was permanent and deserved. "Tyler, I know I can never undo what I did to you," she said during our final conversation before she left California forever. "I spent so many years hating you for being Dad's favorite that I became something monstrous. I'm moving to Portland to start over with a different name and hopefully find some way to build a legitimate life." The transformation in our relationship was both heartbreaking and healing. For the first time in our adult lives, Emily and I spoke to each other as equals rather than rivals competing for parental approval. The sister I'd grown up with had been buried under decades of resentment, but the woman saying goodbye was someone I could finally respect. "Em, what we did took courage," I told her as she packed her car. "Dad taught us that power meant destroying others, but we chose to use our power to reveal truth instead. That's worth something." The legal proceedings took 8 months to fully resolve. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, insider trading, and racketeering charges that painted a picture of systematic corporate criminality dating back to Blackwood Technologies' founding. The company was dissolved, its assets liquidated to compensate the dozens of competitors and thousands of employees who had been victimized by Dad's schemes. But the most satisfying resolution came from an unexpected source: Nexus Dynamics. Their attempted acquisition of Blackwood Technologies had been based entirely on stolen intelligence provided by Emily, and when that intelligence was revealed as the product of corporate espionage, their own stock price collapsed. The SEC investigation expanded to include Nexus executives who had knowingly participated in the conspiracy, resulting in additional prosecutions, and a complete leadership restructuring the tech industry, publication that had dismissed me as a spoiled heir having a public meltdown, now featured me on their cover as the whistleblower who exposed Silicon Valley's biggest corporate crime syndicate. But the recognition felt hollow compared to something far more valuable. I had discovered who I really was when everything else was stripped away. Marcus Rivera and I founded a cybersecurity consulting firm that specialized in corporate fraud investigation and digital forensics. Our first major client was the FBI, which hired us to analyze evidence in cases similar to Dad's. The irony wasn't lost on me. The skills Dad had dismissed as teenage hacking nonsense became the foundation for a legitimate business built on integrity rather than criminality. 6 months after Dad's sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor at our San Francisco office. Catherine Walsh, the investor who had allowed me to present evidence at that fateful board meeting, had a proposition that would change my life again. "Tyler, I represent a consortium of venture capital firms that want to invest in ethical technology companies led by people with uncompromising integrity," she explained. "We've been watching your work with corporate fraud investigation, and we believe you have the vision and moral character to build something genuinely revolutionary." She offered me $50 million in startup funding to create a new kind of technology company. 1. Focused on transparency, ethical business practices, and products that strengthened rather than exploited democratic institutions. The funding came with only one condition. I had to promise never to use the Blackwood name in any business context. "Catherine, I wouldn't want to use that name anyway," I replied. "Everything worthwhile I've ever done has been accomplished despite that legacy, not because of it." The conversation with Dad that I'd been dreading finally happened during my single visit to federal prison. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the knowledge that his carefully constructed empire had been revealed as a house of cards. "Tyler, you destroyed everything I built," he said, his voice carrying none of its old authority. "No, Dad," I replied calmly. "I revealed what you really built. The difference is that now everyone knows the truth." For the first time in my life, I walked away from Richard Blackwood feeling genuinely free. I had learned that real power came from building rather than destroying, from creating value rather than stealing it, and from choosing integrity even when destruction would have been easier. The countdown that had once terrified me had become the timeline of my transformation from entitled heir to ethical entrepreneur. 18 months after exposing my father's criminal empire, I stood in the lobby of Rivera Blackwood Cybersecurity Solutions, watching our employees collaborate on projects that would protect rather than exploit the digital infrastructure our society depended on. The company name honored Marcus's partnership while acknowledging my own journey from complicity to accountability. Our offices in downtown San Francisco deliberately contrasted with the sterile, corporate aesthetic of Blackwood Technologies. Natural light flooded collaborative spaces where engineers, investigators, and analysts worked together on cases that ranged from protecting election security to exposing corporate fraud. The walls displayed awards from civil rights organizations, thank you letters from whistleblowers we'd protected, and news articles about criminals we'd helped prosecute. Tyler, the FBI just confirmed that our analysis of the Meridian Corporation case led to indictments for 12 executives, Marcus announced as he entered my office with a satisfied grin. That's $800 million in stolen pension funds that will be returned to retirees. The work was more fulfilling than I'd ever imagined possible. Each case reminded me that technology could be a force for justice rather than exploitation, and that the analytical skills I'd inherited could serve society rather than personal ambition. We'd helped expose 3 major corporate conspiracies, protected dozens of whistleblowers from retaliation, and pioneered forensic techniques that were being adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. The friends I'd made were people who respected my work rather than my bank account. My girlfriend Sarah was a federal prosecutor who'd met me through a case collaboration, someone who was more impressed by my commitment to justice than any material wealth I might possess. The Blackwood case changed how white-collar crime is prosecuted in this country, she'd told me during one of our early dinners together. You proved that even the most sophisticated corporate criminals leave digital evidence if investigators know where to look. My relationship with money had fundamentally changed as well. The $50 million investment from Catherine Walsh's consortium had been structured to ensure that I could live comfortably while preventing the accumulation of obscene wealth that had corrupted my father. Most of our profits were reinvested in expanding our investigative capabilities or donated to organizations that supported corporate accountability and democratic transparency. Living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco's Mission District, I discovered pleasures that my previous mansion had never provided. Cooking my own meals, using public transportation, shopping at farmers markets, simple activities that connected me to the community I served, rather than isolating me in elite privilege. Most surprising development was my relationship with Emily. After 2 years of self-imposed exile in Portland, she'd rebuilt her life as a social worker specializing in financial literacy education for low-income families. Her work helping people understand predatory lending practices and investment scams was a form of penance for her role in Dad's schemes. "Tyler, I spent so many years believing that success meant taking from others," she said during one of our quarterly visits. "Now I understand that real satisfaction comes from giving people the tools to protect themselves from people like we used to be." Our conversations were cautious but genuine, built on shared understanding of the damage that family wealth and favoritism had inflicted on both of us. We would never be close siblings, but we'd found a way to respect each other's journey toward redemption. The most difficult conversation came when Dad's appeals were exhausted and his 22-year sentence became final. I visited him one last time, not seeking reconciliation but wanting closure for my own healing process. "Tyler, I built that company to give you opportunities I never had," he said from behind the prison's reinforced glass partition. "Dad, you built that company by destroying other people's opportunities," I replied. "The only good thing that came from your empire was learning what kind of person I never wanted to become." Walking away from that prison visit, I felt the final weight of my family legacy lift from my shoulders. Richard Blackwood had taught me valuable lessons about power, ambition, and moral choice, though not the lessons he'd intended. The technology company I was building with Catherine Walsh's investment was launching in 6 months, focused on developing cybersecurity tools that would protect democratic institutions from the kind of corporate manipulation Dad had perfected. Our first product would help election officials detect and prevent digital interference, while our second would give journalists forensic tools to investigate financial corruption. Standing on the roof of our office building that evening, looking out over San Francisco Bay where so many technological innovations had been born, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Sometimes we need to lose everything we think we want in order to discover what we actually need. If this story has inspired you to examine the difference between inherited privilege and earned integrity, to question whether your success comes at others' expense, or to consider how you might use whatever advantages you possess to strengthen rather than exploit the communities around you, then perhaps my family's destruction has served a purpose greater than any empire Richard Blackwood ever imagined building. The countdown that once threatened to destroy me had instead become the timeline of my rebirth.